So thank you everyone for coming today. This is a hybrid event, so you are being recorded somewhat, not the people in the room, but for those attending, we are recording. Welcome to the Armenian Institute. My name is Tatiana Deravidisyan. I'm the Chair of Trustees of the Armenian Institute. We are the leading Armenian arts and cultural charity in the UK, helping promote Armenian history and culture and making it a living experience for a broader audience. We hold one of the largest collection of Armenian books in Europe, and I would welcome, for those of you in the room, to explore our collection later after this talk. I'm very pleased to have with us today Thomas, and we are going to have a talk with Thomas on locating me in the Middle East. So Thomas received his PhD in American Studies from the George Washington University, after earlier receiving degrees from Yale and the New York University. Currently faculty at the Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies at Emory and faculty affiliate in the Center for Arts, Migration and Entrepreneurship at the University of Florida. He is also researching and writing a new volume of history for the Armenian General Benevolent Union, and he is also a consultant for the Los Angeles County's Anti-Racism, Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. His work has been supported by a range of national and international research institutions. I don't know where he finds time for all of this. And he has previously completed a year as a Fulbright US teaching scholar in the Department of History at the American University in Cairo. Today's session is going to be a presentation from Thomas, and it will be followed by Q&A. And I will hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So first off, really, thank you to everyone for coming. I'm glad it's being recorded. I'm glad you can't see my bald spot. I don't think you can, at least. So I was going to say, although I've been to the UK a few times for research, I really don't know London very well. So one of the joys of coming for this talk and doing this travel that I'm doing for the AGBU is a chance to connect with so many different Armenian communities and multiple contexts. And I'm really treating this project as a kind of multi-sided ethnography, of contemporary Armenianness and Armenian life. And I bring that up because it's part of the way that I came to the subject of this talk. So in particular, I've been struck that, as the Middle East, a Middle Eastern and North African category emerged on the US Census, and that's the image that I have here, the place of Armenians within this category, Armenians' attitudes towards this category, were really quite ambiguous, if not contrarian. So for example, I was inspired by this special issue brought together by Bedros Dermatosian and Sosi Kasparian in the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Fault Lines and Fractures in the 2020 Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh War, Silence, Absence, and Erasure in Middle East Studies. The image I have here is Bedros's article, Ambivalence to Things Armenian in Middle Eastern Studies in the War on Artsakh, all of which kind of lamented the marginalization of Artsakh and Armenians writ large in Middle Eastern studies, despite this being the predominant home for Armenian studies in the US, right? And I think it's no accident that I'm in Middle Eastern and South Asian studies, right? This is the place that I found that welcomed the kind of work that I'm doing. At the same time, though, in my travels, I frequently saw what I can only describe as horror among Armenians to be described as Middle Eastern. So the questions of this talk, to flag from the get-go, are very personal, are very, very sensitive, I know are controversial, but also for that reason, incredibly theoretically rich. So I invite you to take a journey with me on this. And with that in mind, and to tip my theoretical hat, I want to note that some of the still preeminent strains in continental theory that I'm thinking with, perhaps controversial among Brits, Foucault and Derrida, right, really work on the relationship between epistemology and ontology, categories and knowledge, language as it attempts to model the world. So I take it as a given that ideas, concepts, and even language are contingent, constructed, idiosyncratic, and therefore subject to change and certainly manipulation. So in that vein, I want to say from the get-go, in the words of Gertrude Stein, there's no there, right? I'm not attempting to study Armenian communities in the Middle East. We could certainly talk about that, right? I'm not aiming to talk about the Middle East. I'm really trying to focus on the idea of the Middle East and offer some intellectual rigor to perhaps explain, well, why can't we locate Armenians in Middle Eastern studies, in ethnic studies, in post-colonial studies, as Gayatri Spivak and David Kazanjan have questioned, again, to think beyond this as an identity category, um, where I think even experts often resort to feeling ideology as opposed to really thinking about this rigorously and historically. So to begin, I'd like to start with a bit of an anecdote that is personal as opposed to professional. So as a child born in Bermuda, raised in South Florida, and frankly, ambiguously ethnic before this was fashionable, my least favorite, yet somehow most frequent question was, well, what are you? Or the equivalent, where are you from? When Armenian didn't satisfy people, I asked my mother, well, what should I say? How do I respond to this question? And she counseled, Middle Eastern, but not Muslim, which is a sensitive and cynical, qualification, particularly for a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, again, growing up in a space where I was mostly interpreted as Latino. This response, though, rarely fully satisfied their skepticism, and I was often unsuccessful in convincing them that no, my name was not in fact Tomas. My last name is just Dolan, not Dolan. For James Joyce fans in the room, that's obviously Irish. And again, a separate source of opprobrium. But all that to say that from the get-go, I had a sense of racial ambiguity, and again, trying to locate myself, that at least for my family, was in the Middle East. These memories haunted me, though, and informed my trying to make sense of my place in the world, especially in my secondary and tertiary education, and in another life as a performer. So as an undergraduate studying history and international studies, and later a graduate student feverishly, if not obsessively and angrily, reading across American, ethnic, and Middle East studies, the most common note in my marginalia was, where is me? However, far from navel-gazing or narcissism, the me didn't refer to me, it referred to the Middle East. It was my abbreviation for Middle East. So in other words, while the Middle East loomed large in American cultural imaginaries, right, and foreign policy, my most frequent critique of scholarship was the elision of the Middle East. In other words, I found so many works who were all well and good, made compelling arguments about racism, about globality, about imperialism, but their analysis really would fall apart if they integrated the Middle East. And it didn't seem to occur to them that the Middle East was this kind of lacuna, gaping hole in their analysis. That said, I also found Middle Eastern studies wanting for the reasons that folks like Dermatosian and Kasparian have emphasized. There, my frequent marginalia note was Armos, question mark, echoing again the Ijmas roundtable, where I wondered, okay, where are Armenians, though, in this analysis? They've somehow also fallen out of this analysis, even in some Ottoman histories. So folks like Sebu Aslanian have diagnosed a deforming methodological nationalism, which means that Armenians are often marginalized, a phenomenon sometimes doubled, in fairness, by the insularity of Armenian studies that treats Armenians, or can treat Armenians, as a somehow isolated, autonomous community adrift and disconnected from the region in which we are indigenous. So this is an odd and deeply problematic phenomenon, in my read, given the thousands of years of documented history of Armenians in Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, the Caucasus. And not surprisingly, my dissertation examines diasporic figures as a means to underscore the analytic imprecision of Middle East and the general absence of race in these analyses. And with a committee split between disciplines, as I mentioned, I think it's no surprise that I ended up first at AUC in Cairo and now in Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies at Emory. So here you'll see some of the contours of the talk that I'm going to give today. And given the state of the U.S. in general, the recent creation of a Middle Eastern and North African category on the census, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the Armenian Republic's deepening ties to the EU, and all that the Armenian Republic stands to lose in the kind of escalating war in the region, these realities demonstrate exactly the contradiction and the categorical problems that drove me to study in the first place. So European and American engagement with Armenians actually has quite a long history. And while I cannot give more than a hits parade today, I want to sketch a few key points of contact while underscoring the novelty of the Middle East as a development, and particularly the Middle East as a phenomenon that follows the relatively late ascendance of the Anglophone world, of Britain and the United States as global hegemons. So the French and Italians, for example, have really ancient and deep histories with Armenians that predate France and Italy, and actually in some ways date to the Byzantine and Roman empires. the Frankish Crusader states, a Franco-Ottoman alliance that sent the first French missionaries to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. To wit, by the start of the 17th century, Armenians had established the first coffee shop in Paris, an Armenian printing press in Marseille, ancient merchant families like Giorgio Armani's and relatives of the Gulbenkians, also in Marseille, to say nothing of European Levantines in the region itself. As we know, the UK didn't and really still doesn't have a sizable Armenian community, but it did have a long history of encountering Armenians in its kind of imperial centers and particularly colonial holdings, like Chennai, Calcutta, where Armenians helped the British East India Company negotiate its first contracts, places in the Ottoman Empire, Cairo, Istanbul, Basra, Nicosia, Jerusalem. We talked a little bit about many of these places before the talk. So we primed the pump. These Armenians, however, were Orientals. And Armenians' intermediacy, or better duality, as both Oriental, by dint of their geographic origins, fluency in local languages and cultures, while somewhat or conveniently westernized as a result of their Christianity, was a boon. So hence the Orient, or Near Orient, and our continued use of terms like Oriental rugs, Oriental Orthodox churches, which we also talked about, despite Oriental largely falling out of fashion or falling out of common usage in English. In this Orient, both real and imagined, Armenians were omnipresent as characters in opera, theater, and music. There's a wonderful book by Alexandre Cyrenosian about Armenians in kind of early music and Baroque opera. Highly recommend. They pop up in Corneille's Paléucte, in academic formations like the Faculty of Foreign Languages, Oriental Languages in Paris, translation schools that the French as well as British established across the Mediterranean, and the discipline of Orientalism writ large. While these programs prioritized ruling languages, Ottoman, Persian, and to a lesser extent, Arabic, Armenian, and biblical languages like Aramaic or Hebrew, certainly Armenians were a part of this formation. And here I would argue, gently, this is a space where Edward Said simply got it wrong. Europeans for centuries didn't imagine a Middle East that was Arab and Islamic. They imagined one that was multi-ethnic. It was an Orient. It was ruled by Ottomans, Persians, Mughals, but populated by a range of subject peoples. Okay. So here an image of this kind of broader world that I'm trying to conjuring and Europeans did conjure. So terms like the Middle or Near East began to emerge only at the end of the 19th century. Although the American strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan is often credited with coining the term in 1902, the Middle East was actually already in relatively common usage in Anglophone diplomatic and academic circles throughout parts of the 19th century, certainly the second half. However, this wasn't the Middle East of today. I should have given you a map of this, but I didn't build it. But if you can listen carefully. So for Mahan, the Middle East, I like maps, so I have a lot of maps, but this is what I didn't do, which I feel bad about. The Middle East referred to an area from Arabia to what's present-day Afghanistan on the approach to the British Raj, while the Near East referred to the Balkans, Asia Minor, and the Levant, effectively the Ottoman Empire. Right? So by this logic, the overwhelming majority of Armenians were Oriental or near, not Middle Eastern, though of course some were. So therefore, when the earliest programs were established to study the region, beginning in the first half of the 20th century, they were mostly near, not Middle Eastern, which seems like a small semantic difference, but it's really going to be at the crux of the talk today. These are places like Princeton, Yale, Chicago, NYU, until recently the University of Michigan, to say nothing of Oriental Studies at Oxford. I had flagged this here, which is still, right, like the formation is still in Oriental Studies as opposed to Near or Middle Eastern Studies. Some programs like Michigan have changed from Near to Middle Eastern Studies in the last 20 years. So these designations were never quite equivalent in English in the first place, but they also certainly didn't correspond with French, German, Spanish, and Russian language or formations, epistemic formations of the region. Where the European powers did agree was in a worldview that privileged themselves and Europe, east of what, after all? But more to the point, it emphasized empire. The British Raj, Russian Empire, American Empire, and even the Ottoman and Persian empires were the dominant paradigms for mapping the world's geographies. Thus, why the Near East followed the Ottomans and their waning territories in the Balkans, where Easternness referred to areas ruled by non-Christians, perhaps, or areas that were, again, east of what was understood as Europe. In this era, though, as I'm trying to signal, European and American writers had no difficulty locating Armenians and wrote about Armenians within the dominant paradigms lobbed at any non-Western peoples, as many, many, many scholars have shown. Often racialized as ersatz and inferior Jews of the Orient. So, for example, the 1902 Encyclopedia Britannica suggested that, quote, Armenians are essentially an Oriental people, greedy of gain, quarrelsome in small matters, self-seeking and wanting in stability, gifted with a tendency to exaggeration and a love of intrigue. They are deeply separated by religious differences, and their mutual jealousies, their inordinate vanity, their versatility, and their cosmopolitan character must always be an obstacle to the realization of the dreams of their nationalists. We can sit with that and think with that ad nauseum, I think, in Armenian land. But I want to flag again the way that this circulated, and it was especially common within elite British diplomatic circles. So folks like Lord Cromer, the de facto ruler of Egypt, Mark Sykes, whose name we recognize for drafting the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divvied up the Ottoman Empire. Initially, if we remember, it also included Russia and Italy, as well as Britain and France. But he had particularly anti-Armenian things to say, which I would argue foreshadowed the British policy of privileging Ashkenazi Jews over other peoples in Palestine, which of course included Armenians. So Sykes commented, quote, even Jews have their good points, but Armenians have none. His cowardice, his senseless untruthfulness, the depth of his intrigue, even in the most trivial matters, his habit of hoarding, his lack of one manly virtue, his helplessness in danger, his natural and instinctive treachery, together form so vile a character that pity is stifled and judgment unbalanced. Okay, so there was, in fairness, a separate strain of Anglo-American foreign policy that romanticized Arabs through folks like Lawrence of Arabia, Kurds, who have really been often kind of occluded in like the pro-Kurdish British policy of this time period. But often these were frankly at the expense of Armenians. And as Susan Patty has shown, Armenian legionnaires, for example, fought to liberate Palestine as opposed to help Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, or I should say the Armenian genocide unfolding under the Young Turks. Another positive strain, many Protestants looked to the Armenian church's rejection of the Council of Chalcedon, right, as a sign that they actually shared a kind of a common view or ancient view of Christianity, a simplified view of Christianity. The Archbishop of Canterbury was actually really quite supportive of Armenians across many moments. But at the same time, Armenian Christianity was often skewered as mysticism, and the depravity that I mentioned had to do often with people's polygamy or selling daughters or wives or, untoward sexual practices. That feels a lot like Orientalism, which we kind of know. So even the Ottomans, disproportionately Balkan in terms of their ruling class, and the Young Turks similarly referenced Eastern, non-Turkish areas, Armenian or Kurdish, as Oriental and backwards, with many of the same anxieties that Europeans did. So in this regard, I would say Europeans of all stripes treated Armenians no differently than other Eastern peoples in general, or for that matter, how Ashkenazi Jews wrote about Sephardic Jews, right? So there was still this kind of East-West divide that was really quite salient. Here's just a view to remind you of the Ottoman Empire in this time period. Of course, rank-and-file Americans, British and French, also encountered the Orient through popular culture in places like the World's Fair in London, Paris, this is in Chicago, in the second half of the 19th century, where scholars took up preeminent assumptions about the region as either the Holy Land or Egypt, and launched the infamous American obsession with belly dance via Little Egypt. Many performers claimed they were Little Egypt. A rotating cast of performers in Chicago portrayed Little Egypt. They included Sephardic Jews, Greeks. I'm not aware of Armenians, but at least Merjan does a brilliant take on Aurora Mardiganian, right, in the Auction of Souls, and the fact that they had stand-ins who were Turkish, Jewish, Greek for Aurora. So I want to emphasize this moment, a certain kind of fungibility. Many Americans and Europeans also touched on what would become more than a passing anxiety about race, wringing their hands about whether to claim ancient Egypt as black or white, and the scandal of white slavery in the Ottoman Empire, where many interpreted harem slaves from across the Ottoman region, especially Circassians, as white. We'll come back to that. In addition to serious commercial investments, many Brits and Americans encountered the Near East or Middle East through missionary memoirs. I want to also map for us. These were sites of missionary colleges and universities. So we can see it's, again, very much the sort of Levantine space, as well as adventure travelogues that I would venture started with Marco Polo, who lands in Cilicia, Galicia. The most famous of these colleges were those like AUB that still survive today, although there are, of course, others that did not survive the Armenian genocide, since Armenians were the largest single cohort of people enrolled in these American missionary institutions. Another image that we'll know, this is from Near East Relief, that I would argue, well, not argue, is born out of missionary elites, primarily Protestant Americans, who rally together. It's, interestingly enough, initially relief committees for Armenian, Syrians, and Persia. So again, it's often been collapsed as an exclusively Armenian rescue mission. It's really not. It responds to the famine in Mount Lebanon, and it, again, is initially trying to reach anywhere that missionaries have had a presence, which included also what we now know as Iran. Separate story, which actually is kind of related to this. So importantly for my research, this is when we see the first large number of Ottoman peoples come to the Americas, as well as to Europe in far lesser numbers. Many of these folks are called Turks. As we may well know, this is an example of the Ottoman imam, and these are students at Columbia University in, I think, 1906 or 7. My point being, these are not, to go back to Fez or Tarbush, right? These are people, this is a multi-ethnic cohort of peoples from the Ottoman Empire who were, though, in at least newspaper coverage, referred to as Turks, right? So I wanted to just kind of think about, okay, what does it mean that there is a sort of fungibility between these peoples and a bias towards empire? And then later on, we'll see a bias towards nationalism that I've already flagged that can obscure non-majoritarian peoples. There was a brief Muslim ban in the 1890s in the United States, primarily around fears of polygamy. Believe it or not, this is inspired by Utah admission to the United States as a Mormon state. So I want to flag again, like we can point to this as an example of Islamophobia, which sure, it is. There's certainly a preference for Christian peoples, but it also is tied to a very particular facet of Islam, polygamy, or the idea that Muslims are all going to be polygamous. What this meant, though, is that many Muslim immigrants, at least to the Americas, claim Christian identities, right? And some of you may also be aware that, well, I was going to say, they claim these identities in part because also Ottomans are policing Armenian movement, right? Which mean that Muslims are not supposed to leave the empire. So we see that at the point of departure and the point of entry, people, whether or not they are actually Christian, are claiming that they are Christian because this greased the wheels of their mobility, right? Even if they refer to as Turks, they could say, well, I'm a Turk, but I'm a Christian, or I'm actually an XYZ. And it relied on the largesse or the misunderstandings often of immigration officials to say, oh, sure, I don't know what you are. Again, these peoples were really quite fungible in this moment. This is an example just of coverage. Mohammedans now have a place of worship. This is in New York City. There's an Ottoman mosque, which is one of the earliest mosques in the Americas. This imam is really, really a fascinating figure. So I don't think much work has been written on him, but really, really worth taking a look. Another example of Armenians in the Americas. This is, as you can see, the Kohar theater troupe of, radical Diyarbakir Armenians. This is my great uncle Nishan. Thank you to Hushamadian for digging up this thing and for me recognizing someone who looks like everyone in my family. You'll notice that I haven't really touched too deeply on what many would argue is the master category of modernity, and I am American, so I'm going to say race. But this is where I really want to kind of bring race back into our story, but not in as simplistic ways as I think we often treat it. So if we look closely at this time period, I would argue that scholarship, particularly in American critical whiteness studies and American ethnic studies, which has brought its categories to bear on much of the rest of the world, there's an assumption that many ethnic groups emigrated and became white. right? The story that's often narrated as well, Italians, Irish, Ashkenazi Jews came to the States and then became white. I'm not convinced that this scholarship hasn't done more harm than good. I think by fundamentally distorting the historical record, focusing on court cases, ignoring popular culture, and kind of thinking more theoretically, in more theoretically sophisticated ways about what race really might mean. It certainly doesn't deal with the Middle East, and hence, again, my reading all these works with so much frustration and saying, where is me? As folks like Nell Irvin Painter, Tom Guglielmo, Eric Arneson, myself, have shown, this field has really distorted the fact that these groups were almost categorically classified legally as white. They didn't become white, they were white, though certainly still subject to discrimination. And again, this is where the Middle East offers a really interesting corrective. I hope you'll see where I tie these things together later on. So unlike European peoples whose racial status was really never challenged, a series of racial prerequisite cases challenged the immigration and naturalization of Ottomans. So here's an example of two dueling, I guess, op-eds in the New York Times. Is the Turk a white man? So, for example, North Carolina Senator F.M. Simmons exclaimed that Ottoman immigrants pardon me, quote, nothing more than the degenerate progeny of the Asiatic hordes, the spawn of the Phoenician curse. Again, a funny and ambiguous term given the Phoenician scheme, Wes Anderson's new movie that is clearly based on Gulbenkian. In response, Arab and Armenian immigrants mobilized a range of claims, legal claims, claiming Caucasian or Indo-European ancestry, claiming Phoenician, not Arab or Muslim ancestry, their Christian religion, whether it was real or not, origins in the Holy Land, difference from Turks, who they argued were the real Asiatic barbarians, as well as economic, social, and romantic success among other white Americans that proved their status and acceptance. This is what folks like John Tehranian have called the performance of whiteness, or a performative element of racial indeterminacy. I know this is a little bit small, but this will give you an example of these are all the different kinds of peoples whose racial indeterminacy is challenged. Asian Indians, Punjabis, Syrians, Filipinos, Koreans, Armenians. So there are, again, challenges or indeterminacy around all these different immigrant groups in the States. So it gives you a sense of really how broad, right, how much confusion there actually was about racial categorization in this moment. And these cases really begin in 1909 as kind of the first case challenging Arab immigration. The overwhelming majority of these cases confirmed Armenian and Arab whiteness. Here's why. And this is where I think critical whiteness studies especially gets things wrong and misses the boat. And here's where I'm going to tie together these different sort of threads that or attempted to tie together these many threads that I've shown you. I would argue the reason is scientific racism, or more aptly, racialism. The idea that the world could be divided into and understood through race. So scientific racialism often used race as we might use ethnicity or ethnic group, and it particularly divided the world into three categories: Caucasoid, Mongoloid, or Negroid. Sometimes a red race for native peoples in the Americas. And believe it or not, these assumptions built on histories of Caucasian, the Bible, philology, multiple strands. So here to give you a map from the time period of like, here's how the world might be divided, in which blue, right, we're talking about sort of broadly Caucasoid peoples. We have this sort of, these are the darker races, and these are the, again, I hate to use this terminology, it's not mine, yellow races, right? So you see this really, and there's spaces where they're mix, or it's like kind of indeterminate, right? If there's been miscegenation or some kind of mixture over time. But you see how it's a really quite simplified racial schema that is not how we think about the world today. To give you another image, this is from Madison Grant, who's perhaps the most famous of the race scientists, at least in the English-speaking world. And this map is actually prepared by his cartographer, Leon Dominian, who is an Istanbul Armenian who emigrates to the States and works as a librarian for the American Geographical Society for many years. That's a separate project, which I will someday write and need to write, but really, really interesting figure. So what I want to get at now is Caucasian, of real import for Armenians as a concept. So Caucasian is really a fanciful 18th century invention whose origins are anything but straightforward. So although it's generally credited to Johann Blumenbach and ruminations in his 1775 on the natural variety of mankind, he really may not have been the first to use the term. Um, he honed in on Caucasian skulls among his 200-something skull collections due to the Caucasus Mountains' proximity to Mount Ararat, the mystical resting place of Noah's Ark, assuming that these skulls might offer a glimpse into God's antediluvian design, right? So his thinking was, oh, these are skulls that were close to this place where we think Noah's Ark landed, where the Garden of Eden must have been somewhere nearby. This is a way that we can sort of see the most primordial, the most original man. That was important for Europeans. Why? He praised the beauty of Georgian skulls. He also praised Ethiopians' skulls, right? So again, I want to emphasize this really has very little to do with like actually Caucasian peoples. It has to do with his vision of what a beautiful skull was and a need to locate the Garden of Eden in this place. Other Europeans, Christophe Meiners, Georges Cuvier, again, for whom the Caucasus were abstract, similarly kind of emphasize this. Caucasian benefited from these biblical bona fides, and it benefited from the fact that it was a more palatable solution to philologists who had identified the links between European languages and Indian languages, hence Indo-European, particularly Sanskrit. So while some folks like Sir William Jones, Johann Gottfried von Herder, Friedrich Schlegel argued that the course of all quote, the course of all languages, all thought, and all poetry of the human spirit, everything stems from India without exception, and also insisted that language was not race. But for other Europeans, Caucasian offered a means to explain that it was actually the Caucasus, not the Indian subcontinent, that was the Garden of Eden and the source of human civilization. And therefore, they could heave a collective sigh of relief that they weren't actually related to the Asian Indians that they were colonizing. I'm belaboring these mental gymnastics, and again, as I said, there's no there there, to emphasize that Caucasian really had nothing to do with people in the Caucasus, nor does it really have anything meaningful to do with, say, Scandinavia, right? Or whatever, blonde peoples that we imagine as the paragon of caucasity, right? That's from the Instagram. Instead, I would say it has to do with Europeans refusing to acknowledge their indebtedness to Indian civilizations, their refusal to countenance a non-white identity for ancient Egypt, their refusal to possibly countenance that the figures of the Bible might be different from them in, again, what were becoming racial terms. So Caucasian is a convenient way to kind of sidestep these debates. So in the near, or again, as we said, Middle East, oh, pardon me, this is Madison Grant, passing of the Great Race. So when the Near East and ideas of the Middle East are formulated, race scientists understood Armenians, Arabs, Assyrians as prototypical Oriental or Near Eastern peoples. But they also understood that these people were white or Caucasoid, again, because there was such a limited taxonomy of what the options could be. So the most influential European and American eugenicists, Felix von Luschen, Madison Grant, Henry Ford, von Eichstätt, Carlton Kuhn, Jan Czekanowski, Nazi ideologues like Hans Günther, German Jewish race scientists, and even Hitler claimed Armenoids were the genetic substrate of the Near East, that they had later intermixed with Greco-Roman, Persian, Arab, Turkic conquerors. And as such, modern Armenians were the truest representation of this primordial type. And actually that they might even be the origin of ancient Jews. So I'm going to give you some quotes now that are going to be unpleasant similarly. So here are two from Felix von Luschen and Hans Günther. So noticing the surprising similarity of the European Jews with many Near Eastern Armenians and with the Syrians of North Syria, and with the representations of the Hittite Aramaeans, the majority of Jews belong to this Near Eastern North Syrian type called Armenoid. Sorry, you probably can't read this. but I'm not going to unplug it. A Near Eastern race originated in the Caucasus in the 5th and 4th millennia BC before spreading to Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The original race was preserved in its most hereditarily unadulterated form in the modern-day Armenians, the most ungovernable people of all. And this is from Hans Günther, who is the most cited Nazi race ideologue in the 1930s. So again, I want to emphasize on the one hand, this makes it sound like I'm making an argument about indigeneity, and we were talking about 23andMe. There are ways that I am excited and intrigued to see the possibly positive outcomes of this that will show that peoples are actually quite more genetically interconnected than we may imagine. But on the flip side, I've seen really, really quite toxic, and if not kind of genocidal claims being made, especially again in the TikTok, which I am not not subjecting you to today. And again, scrutiny wasn't necessarily good, right? So difference underwrote restrictive housing covenants, immigration and naturalization laws, racial prerequisite cases mentioned above. And I would argue that compounded by the horrors and degradations of the Armenian genocide, Armenians, not Arabs, for example, were written into racially restrictive covenants in places like Dearborn, Michigan, which is now the largest Arab American community in the States. It's right near the River Rouge Ford plant, right? It's a boom town in the turn of the century. Again, I just want to flag a source of shame for some folks, but a reality is that it's Armenians and not Arabs that in this era are flagged as being the undesirables. I would argue it dovetails with perhaps, again, their savviness in business, but I think largely the fact that states are loath to welcome refugees and particularly poor people. And in the case of Armenians, those who have experienced the unspeakable horrors of being deported and watching family members die in the genocide meant that these were not the best people that they hoped would come to the United States. This is a long quote, so don't worry about reading it. But I just want to name that it wasn't just like many, many peoples were participating in and mobilizing these arguments about whiteness because it was a proxy and necessity for citizenship, for mobility, for movement. This is Philip Hitti, who founds the program in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton. Just to give you a highlight, he's talking, well, I guess you can't really read. Northern Arabians are dolichocephalic, long-headed Southerners were brachycephalic, right? So thinking in these same kind of terms about craniometry, head sizes. And again, this is a proudly Arab American person who advocated for Palestine and was really one of the leading experts on Arabness in the States. This was just the lingua franca of the day. And I would really also flag for us that however unpleasant, right, and racist this may be, foundational nationalist texts about Hindutva, about Arabness, about Turkish nationalism, all claim whiteness, right? This is really just, this is the lexicon of the moment, right? Again, as a proxy for power, civilizational bona fides. In fact, as late as the 1940s, a Punjabi immigrant in the States argued that he should be white because as a Muslim, his origins were ultimately Arab. And so he should join Arab Americans and is being recognized as white. So I'm giving you these examples because I like to teach with disorientation as a pedagogical strategy. But again, I want to just flag for us, we're talking about a first half of the century where someone can make an argument that Arab is a proxy for whiteness, which is not how we think about it today and not how most states have organized their racial systems. Great. So I'm going to skip ahead because I feel like I'm going too long. Fungibility. I want to also just kind of remind us, this is actually Sykes-Picot. And I want to really put some weight behind the impact of being classified as Oriental, as being classified in these ways, even as white, but not white of the right kind, right? Had real geopolitical implications. It underwrote foreign policy, it underwrote colonization and the mandate system, the denial of Arab, Armenian, Kurdish, Azeri, and other groups a voice at the Paris Peace Conference. And I want to flag for us that Sykes-Picot, insofar as it attempted to divide up, right, the Ottoman Empire, didn't actually come to pass, such that the map of the Middle East as we know it today would have been impossible to predict, even in 1920. Right? And particularly because at that moment there was a prospect or an expectation that there would also be at least one Armenian state that would be in the center of the region that we now know as the Middle East. Just a few other images from the time. Um, I'm not talking too much about culture here. I'm really trying to focus on these sort of like juridical categories, but just to say, of course, people are also absorbing stereotypes about the Orient through popular culture, through movies, through songs. Um, a really wild one, I've never heard it, but I would love to, is the Armenian Maid, an Oriental song in Foxtrot, where she sort of laments like, oh, I had a sweetheart and then the Turks took me away, and oh, for all you people and your sweethearts. It's a really kind of macabre um, liner note. Um, so yeah, this is all to say that Armenians, of course, participated in self-exotification and participated in their being Oriental. Gulbenkian is his archive and the British National Archives are full of references to him as an Oriental, for example, which again both gave him the savvy and fluency in locales where the British were not as comfortable, but on the flip side also marked him as a kind of perpetual other. So if World War I witnessed a tectonic shift in the region's demographics, pardon me, World War II and the creation of myriad states that now, well, sort of define the Middle East, it also was a major shift in terms of semantics. And in particular, the popular press and governments began employing Middle or Mid-East as opposed to Near East, and reported on particularly the Arab-Israeli wars from places like Cairo, Beirut, or Jerusalem. Um, I found this is using Google Books Ngram, so just to kind of show these shifts. So I've plotted here Middle East, Near East, Armenia, and Arab. So you can see, looking first at the blue and red line, you can see first, I mean, again, I apologize, it's so small, but Near East is the primary way people are talking about the region until 1940, when suddenly there's a huge spike in Middle East. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that happens. You can also see kind of this sort of downward trend of Armenians until the genocide, and then a blip, right? Sort of, I imagine, around the Nagorno-Karabakh wars and independence, right? Again, in the around 1990, right? So again, just to sort of map for you that like literally the citations or usage of these terms crisscross, right? Change quite dramatically around mid-century. And Middle East is the term that I would argue is preeminent. Now, certainly in the English-speaking world, though, not in other languages. At the same time, because of the horrors of the Holocaust and the discrediting of race science, right, we also see that that falls dramatically out of fashion, right? So whereas in the first half of the century, people are talking in these terms, Armenoid, Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid, right? Really, there's a shift away from that around mid-century because there is a discomfort. This is widely written about. This is not me making this claim per se, right? But it means that I would argue this shift between Near and Middle East, a shift away from Armenoid as being part of the Near East, means that Armenians really do fall out of a certain racial common sense around mid-century. The only place they do persist is in white supremacist literature. So here, for example, this is the current site, um, arguing and citing, again, you can see, not, these are mostly white supremacists, but kind of older thinkers, who are talking in these racial and these former racialized terms about Armenoids, short-headed and high skull type, fleshy features, a flat occiput, and hooked nose, black-haired, light brown skin, medium weight. So reading these things can actually make you a little bit crazy. And the way that Armenians are most often described, or I don't know, it's fetishized is not the word because it's a pejorative, is having a sugarloaf-shaped head, which is like a cone head. So again, this is why I really so panicked about my bald spot, both 'cause it's a sign of my middle age, but it's like my cone-shaped head, that is dramatically rising, like ararat in the back of my head. I'm not serious about that. Another example of, again, these other categories that are also circulating. This is like the dark web. So I'm surveilled, I'm sure, 1,000 times over by a million different kinds of government authorities. But just to say that these things are still in circulation, right? But it's really in quite marginal discourse. We're not talking about Armenoid, Caucasoid, Orientalid, right? In academic or governmental discourse, but there are folks who are still understanding the world in these terms. They are white supremacist. At the same time, though, government definitions didn't land on a clear articulation of what the region was. And I would argue they still have not landed on a clear definition of what the region is. So to give you an example, in 1944, the State Department defined its division of Near Eastern affairs as including Greece, Turkey, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and the Arabian Peninsula. And the division of Middle Eastern affairs covered Afghanistan, Burma, Ceylon or Sri Lanka, India, and Iran. Later, the US government continued cozying up with Turkey, crushed leftist uprisings in Greece, aligned itself with Israel, and wrote off those parts of the Balkans, Caucasus, and Central Asia behind the Iron Curtain and redefined the region. So in 1948, for example, it stopped using Middle East in favor of Near East. So you can see how this again has shifted. Near East is in blue. Greece, Turkey, and Iran are different. They're different things. I would argue they're more closely allied with the US, so they're given a different category. South Asian affairs becomes part of like the moniker. In 1974, again, it had already done away with Middle East, so it redefined the Near East to include some Arab League nations, Iran, but not Turkey or Sudan, and of course not the Soviet Union. Hold on to this. And these definitions weren't consistent across agencies. So for example, 1965, Hart-Celler, which dramatically redefines immigration in the United States by doing away with the Asiatic barred zone and national origins quotas, defines the Middle East in a totally different way. So you can see here, it kind of combines the Near and Middle East. I'm showing you, I really do love maps. The reason I'm insisted on this one, it includes Pakistan, which in that moment includes Eastern and Western Pakistan. So you see how there's a definition of like the Middle East that's like feels sort of about Islam, but like not entirely about Islam. I mean, India has a larger Muslim population than any of these states, for instance, right? But you see how it's still trying to figure out. It's still quite like in flux. At the same time, I would argue, though, that federal agencies, again, codified racial difference and said, okay, everyone from Morocco to really Afghanistan is going to be coded as white. These people are still white, again, during the Cold War. Well, really until the amendment to the census last year. Importantly, these policy processes bridged foreign and domestic spaces, but they also paralleled developments in American scholarship, particularly around area and ethnic studies. This is also the same time that we see the creation of area studies. It's the same time we see the creation of ethnic studies, though from very different sources. One really US government funded, one kind of bottom-up student uprising funded about emphasizing people of color and third world paradigms. So as we shifted away from Orientalist studies, in part as a result of funding sources, institutionalization, and a far more diverse political landscape, the Social Science Research Council, American Council of Learned Societies, Ford, Carnegie Foundations, US government opened up its coffers to fund language programs and again, to really endow Near or Middle Eastern studies programs. This is in the 60s and 70s. In 1958, the National Defense Act created Title VI, which allowed the number of Near and Middle Eastern studies centers to double by 1968. So again, I want to kind of parallel, much though I'm an academic, I want to say scholars really know what they're doing. Do you see how the government has a hand in creating departments, but the departments and certainly historians in the government are not actually in line about what the purview of this department actually is. And I would say that's part of what is still plaguing the marginalization of, say, Armenians, in Middle East studies. This is an image. This is the Association of Arab American University graduates at their Detroit conference in 1975. In my first book project, I write about Edward Said and really contextualize him within this association. This is when he was most active, when he was a vice president of the organization. And it's really the space where he workshops Orientalism, which for those of you who know becomes this landmark, perhaps one of the most cited works. It's the third most cited work, I think, in Middle East studies, one of the most cited works in post-colonial literature. It pops up everywhere. And really, I argue that we can't think about it without understanding the context in which it's created. It's this context in which area, ethnic studies, and as well as US government investment in the region are being formulated. This is the 70s, though. It's not necessarily today. Um, so again, moving forward, the US government continued to carve out these spaces of exception for pro-US states. One example would be the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and its support of conservative monarchies. At the same time, though, it also in the 80s is marking especially Palestinian, Armenian, Kurdish leftists as terrorists, right? As unwanted Middle Easterners, right? And the census is doing the same thing, disaggregating Armenian, Arab, Iranian folks as Middle Easterners in the same time period. So you see how, again, this has more to do with politics as opposed to religion. But again, there's so many slippages between these different categories. So to give you a sense where the census made this much, much worse, as I said, for decades, it disaggregated Armenians, Arabs, and Iranians in the States as Middle Easterners. These are also fascinating reports to read. In 1980, it lumped the entire region into Asia. So it classified these peoples all as Asian before later backtracking and disaggregating again. In 2000, it simply characterized everyone as Arab, right? And then similarly had to backtrack when people said, well, wait a minute, where did like the Armenians go? Um, I want to emphasize, though, that this gives us a common sense, right, in which the Middle East is now quite solidly understood as being Arab and Muslim, right? And this is an evolution that's occurring across the Cold War. This is only emphasized, of course, by 9/11, which I would argue, as many have, really solidifies the image of the Muslim terrorist, right? Whereas we have Palestinian Christian terrorists, we have Puerto Rican terrorists, we have Armenian terrorists. There's actually a new movie coming out with an Armenian terrorist. My last role on stage was playing a French Armenian terrorist. So perhaps like this stereotype is not actually as distant as we think. But of course, 9/11 solidifies the image of the Middle East is Arab, it's Muslim, it's fanatical, it's full of terrorists, right? Or is it? The CIA defines the Middle East in its own way. This is part of Bush II's Greater Middle East Initiative. So you can see here, it includes the newly independent Caucasian republics. And Bush's, again, the Greater Middle East Initiative also extends into Central and South Asia. The CIA actually still uses this definition. So this is in part why definitions at the World Bank, at other UN agencies, and the US within the US federal government, there is not a like intragovernmental understanding of what the Middle East is or is not. One of my favorite images. So I want to say, and this is not to suggest that the US or the UK, its close ally in this, is justified in surveilling, deporting, imprisoning, executing peoples, but just to say that it's doing so with a rubric that is fundamentally nonsensical, right, and internally incoherent. I would point to the fact, of course, that it targeted folks, Iranian Jewish rabbis, Oriental Orthodox priests, Assyrians, Copts, East Africans. Even the Armenian Republic is initially included on the terrorist watch list after 9/11. I would argue that's an outgrowth of Asala and the kind of 80s designation of Armenians as terrorists, frankly. But this is, again, about a bureaucratic and idiosyncratic decision that someone made within the Bush administration and said, oh, yeah, these are also the baddies, right? So again, incoherent. I love this image, but it's also depressing. So now to kind of get back to the census and to wrap up my talk. I'm American. I'm thinking about the US more than anything else, right? But I did look at the British census as well, that kind of replicates American categories in many ways, with the exception of it does not have a Middle Eastern category. Interestingly, it categorizes Armenians as both white and other in its statistical disaggregation. So there's something funky happening, and other has been a really quite popular category among Armenians in the States for a long time. So I'm not sure that the MENA category on the US Census will survive the Trump administration. It nixed it the last time. I'm not sure that people will use it. I'm not sure that it won't be used for nefarious purposes to target people as opposed to, again, be a source of redress. But I want to emphasize to wrap up that the US government has a notoriously, if not categorically, poor record of defining what the Middle East is, but that this then has really ripple effects and ramifications, certainly on scholarship, certainly on popular culture, and the people who are included and not included and understood as being within and without these categories. I'm going to skip 2 and then go back. So this is the current census category on the US census. It was just rolled out. Do you notice anyone missing from this Middle Eastern category? I hope you can see it. I'll walk over here.
Turks?
Turks, not included.
Where?
Who else? Kurds. They're an example category. If you read, the examples are Algerian, Iraqi, Kurdish. So Kurds do make it.
Afghani?
Afghan not included. 30% of Afghans self-identified as Middle Eastern, even when not prompted, didn't make the cut. Not Middle Eastern. Sorry? So Asian Indian, this is a great question. Also British versus American, whereas in the UK, there's, I think, a broader sense of Asian as being encompassing, and particularly the subcontinent. In the US, this is the distinction between American Indian versus Asian Indian. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah. Well, Armenians are not there. Sure, Palestine's not there, right? So I was going to say, this is a fascinating thing. So I bring this up not to get too in the weeds. We can talk about more of this. I know a lot about this, unfortunately, because I spoke to the census and did a lot of advocacy work. But I will flag that the biggest Arab, Iranian, and Armenian lobbies expressed immediately their deep dissatisfaction with this category as it was rolled out, because despite listening sessions, feedback from experts, public comment, the census basically rolled out the category as they had proposed it a decade ago, prior to doing any conversations with community folks, experts, you name it. So again, it's come down to, I know, individuals, individual bureaucrats who have decided the bounds of this region. Again, far disconnected from Middle East studies, far disconnected from identities people would choose themselves. I'm not weighing in on whether or not people should or should not choose these categories, but just to say that now the Middle East is being repurposed and created anew in ways that are including and excluding certain people. Other things I want to flag, it disaggregates or separates Black Arabs. It understands that, like, well, no, people can't be Black and Arab, or they can't be Asian, and any of these identities are meant to be separate things. You can choose separate things. You can choose multiple boxes, rather. But Arab League states like Sudan or Somalia are not included. They're included as examples within the Black category. Transnational groups like Armenians are not included. Palestinians are not included, obviously, I would imagine for political reasons. And the feedback that we got from the horse's mouth from the census was that Armenians maybe should be Asian. And this would be the category that would include Armenians, because some Armenians had chosen that category in the past. As I said, Armenians are a statistical challenge in that Armenians have, no, I mean in the sense that Armenians have self-identified in multiple ways and have chosen white, Asian, Middle Eastern, other, so have generated some confusion among non-Armenians who are actually creating these categories by diktat. And another kind of downside of this is that now in preliminary statistics released by the census, because they are disaggregating in these new ways, there are several hundreds of thousands of Armenians who are from countries that are designated as Middle Eastern, but because they are not Arab, they're being counted as others. So they're MENA others. I would argue this is my personal nightmare, personally, as me as a human, but also in terms of like funding and certainly visibility. This has really serious ramifications for Armenian Americans, although, funding doesn't exist anymore, so who cares? So if I could, again, kind of tie some threads together here. I know I've gone on for a long time. I just wanted to show how various imaginaries, epistemologies, systems and structures about geography and race have particularly ill-served Armenians. And it's in part because they have struggled to define what they mean by an Orient, a Near, or a Middle East. I think it would be a fair thing to say we're in this double bind. Middle East studies has overly privileged Arab-Israeli conflicts. Whiteness studies, as kind of embodied in the census category, has unduly privileged Europe without acknowledging that its formation and its evolution has left behind North Africa and West and Central Asia, which were originally included within its definitions. The concept of nationality and the methodological nationalism, which I mentioned, doesn't serve folks like Armenians or other minorities because it elides or cedes places like Western Armenia, Artsakh, Javakhh, Nakhchivan to other places right? It means that Armenians can no longer be from these places by a logic that sees only the nation state as the bucket in which people fit. And so again, I wanted just to wrap up, to make a claim about being Caucasian is, of course, geographically correct. This is for the Armenians in the room, especially for Hayastansis, for people who are from this region. But in terms of the histories of race, we're kind of talking a different language. It's not quite the whole story. So I know these are some very, very sensitive subjects, and many Armenians, as I mentioned, simply refuse the debate by choosing other or choosing Armenian as the sole option. But my goal today, again, I'm grateful to see this is not an entirely Armenian audience. My goal, though, really was to point to a need to understand these histories and to be savvy about engaging these different discourses and deducing where people are coming from and which room you're entering into. This is for, as I said, this is for the Armenians, and I think that we might find ready allies if we were better able to talk the talk or understand the really convoluted and frankly nonsensical histories that have created these categories and these common senses. I'll stop there. But I do want to leave space for a lot of questions and conversations. So I love these two images. So I'm going to stop with these of, you may have seen these online campaigns to flag where your family is from. I want us to, we'll come back to this as a question. These are different maps, right, that imagine historic Armenia in different ways. So again, this was for the Armenians in the audience, but I'd love to hear some questions and have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And we're also going to take questions from those attending Zoom as well. So Mariana's going to share those with us. I have a question, actually, quite interestingly, because I noticed that the Greeks aren't listed either.
Yep.
And I mean, presumably they would fall into that European category?
Yeah. So this is the thing, and what makes this so challenging is that the census disaggregates on the back end or recodes people as it thinks they fit. So, and again, I know this is a little bit like US centric, and I apologize for, maybe I'm the only American here, but it created an ancestry category, for example, for Armenians for the first time that wasn't Middle Eastern, this census, right? So that's a new development, at least in the eyes of the US state. In terms of Greeks, yeah, I mean, this is why, I'm an Ottomanist in that, like, I refuse to denaturalize, like certainly Anatolian Greeks, Pontic Greeks, myriad Greek communities that certainly might want to be included. But I will also flag the fact that Turkey, the Turkish government, Turkish American lobbies, Aussie American lobbies, no one joined in the conversation or advocated to be included as Middle Eastern, also creates another kind of a blind spot in which, well, if Turkey is just European, or if Asia Minor just becomes European, then like race follows the flag in the sense that wherever the Turkish flag is suddenly is no longer Middle Eastern. So is Aleppo no longer Middle Eastern? If it falls under the purview of Turkey,
and
right?
Have you stand over here
Oh,
so
okay.
that the audience and and just to say that we will share slides, if that's all right. We're going to share some of your slides with the audience. I think what's interesting, and you allude to this as you talk about, and I am going to open this up to questions as well, is the sort of the building up to where the census is. It also means that it's based on people's understanding or limited understanding of history.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it also has an impact on the way in which foreign policy gets dictated as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I love that we don't have a conclusion, because I think that I think you raise a very important point, and it's probably a challenge it's a challenge to academia to rethink in the way that we are educating people, because nation states are quite a new concept, but we are defining people by nation states, and that's not necessarily reflective of people's histories and migration, and what ethnicity really means. Like, what do we mean by ethnicity when we think about those things? And even as someone who grew up in Cyprus, I hear all debates about Cyprus is Greek, and I'll say no, it's not. It's a combination of various different people. So yeah, I want to thank you, Thomas, very much for this very thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. And I hope that even for the people who aren't academics in here, it makes you think a little bit more about, what this, how do you define yourself? How do you communicate to others, whether you are Armenian or not, about who you are? We're going to have some drinks now for those of us in the room. So sorry to those on Zoom. But thank you for donating, for all those of you that did donate online. And thank you to those who have donated here. We're coming to the end of our summer program. So next week is going to be the final program, and we're celebrating Pride. So we'll be doing a workshop, 10 years, celebrating 10 years of queer Armenian writing. So sign up if you'd like to join. It will be online purely. And just to say as well, we do have on display a couple of books if you'd like to buy them. One of them is we republished, we bought the rights and republished Leon Sirmelyan's I Ask You, Ladies and Gentlemen, which is a 1945 New York Times bestseller book. He, after William Sarian, was considered the second best Armenian American author, for those of you that only know Sarian. And we also have Gabriel Gavin's Ashes of Our Father book, which is sort of an analysis or a sort of a first-person writing on his experience covering the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And then a wonderful new book by Caroline Eden on Green Mountains and her travels around the South Caucasus. So Steve and I will help you with that. And yeah, thank you very much for everyone attending. And thank you, Thomas, for hosting this talk for us.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.